No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive. Most of you aren't just listening right now. You're driving, cleaning, and even exercising. But what if you could be saving money by switching to Progressive? Drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Multitask right now. Quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations. I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
The fundamental tension is that while a lot of us are committed to social justice, we also really want to be elites.
That's Musa al-Gharbi, sociologist, journalist, and author of the new book, We Have Never Been Woke: The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite.
We do want to see the oppressed be liberated. We do want to see the poor be uplifted in all of this. But we want to enjoy a higher position than most other people, driving us to taking these more symbolic gestures instead of doing things that we could do in our own lives that could make a difference.
Today, a complex exploration of the tensions that arise when people do and want others to know they do justice in public. All coming right up.
Support for this show comes from the Rabbis Go South podcast. Imagine 16 American rabbis jailed for acting on their beliefs. The Rabbis Go South is a thrilling 7-part narrative podcast that brings to life the real story of Jewish-Black solidarity in St. Augustine, Florida during the Civil Rights Movement. Discover what happened when the rabbis answered MLK's call. Presented by the Hub and Spoke Expo. Find The Rabbis Go South on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. Our guest today is Musa al-Gharbi. We're discussing his new book, We Have Never Been Woke: The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. Musa grew up in a military family in Arizona. He was on track to be a Catholic priest when a crisis of faith left him trying on atheism and philosophy instead. He knew another great personal crisis when in 2010, his twin brother died in Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. In time, Musa converted to Islam. As a Black Muslim public scholar, he originally assumed that only liberal outlets would be interested in publishing his work, so he became well known on outlets like Al Jazeera. Then, an ugly online exchange with a critic led to a very public cancellation by Fox News, which led to a loss of an academic position and a sense of simultaneously being canceled by the left-leaning academic context in which he was working. Out of this matrix of cancellations and challenges, Musa made his way to do a PhD at Columbia and is now an assistant professor at Stony Brook University. Here's Musa al-Gharbi on his new book, We Have Never Been Woke. Welcome, Musa.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Congratulations on already a very widely celebrated book, and so we're really grateful to get to have you with us. You say in the introduction that your book takes part in a tradition of Black critique, but perhaps a tradition of Black critique that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. It goes back to somebody like W.B. Du Bois. So would you unpack for us what that tradition of Black critique entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a tradition of Black critique, as you noted, that goes back to Du Bois, that focuses on how people who present themselves as allies or advocates for African Americans often align with causes like anti-racism or civil rights or things like this to try to find ways to offer up symbolic gestures instead of material goods, allowing in many cases states of affairs that are bad or seem unequal to kind of persist unchanged while everyone feels better about what's happening. And so this is a line of critique that has repeated over time. Towards the end of chapter 2 of the book, I highlight a number of scholars and activists who have emphasized this point, from Martin Luther King to Malcolm X to James Baldwin and others. And so the book does take part in this tradition of critique and analysis within the Black intellectual space.
You put quite a sharp point on it. At one point you say that these elite regularly engage in behaviors that exploit, perpetuate, exacerbate, reinforce, and mystify inequalities, often to the detriment of the very people we purport to champion. So unpack for us a few examples, perhaps, of that.
Sure. So, for instance, an example of how sometimes social justice-oriented language or gestures can mystify inequalities, which is to say, make it more difficult to understand why the distribution looks the way it does, who profits from things, and how, would be talk about privilege. In a lot of sociological circles and activist circles, there's this strong emphasis on white privilege, on getting people to acknowledge and confess their privilege. And there's kind of two things that are strange to me about this ritual. One of them is that there have been actual aristocratic societies where everyone did this. So that back in France, before the aristocracy was overthrown, there was this set of norms called noblesse oblige, where the aristocrats would confess their privilege basically and commit to using their privilege for the sake of the least among us in society. So the fact that you can have like a literal, formal aristocratic society where basically everyone does this ritual should in itself be almost a reductio ad absurdum proof that engaging in this ritual means anything, changes anything, does anything. But one of the ways in which this tendency to encourage people to confess their privilege can actually distort people's understanding of the social world is that this emphasis that all whites have the same privilege and that white people, no matter who you are, whether you're a poor person who lives in a small town and is underemployed, or whether you're a white affluent professor teaching at Harvard University, that you both benefit the same from your whiteness, that's actually not an apt understanding of the social world. In the book, I draw this analogy to illustrate this point about height. So being tall gives people a lot of unearned advantages. I'm 5 inches, 6 inches taller than the national average. That gives me a lot of unearned advantages. Tall people are perceived as more authoritative. They have advantages in the dating market. They get hired more. And this is completely unearned. I didn't earn my height. I didn't do anything to deserve it. Okay. But it's not the case that everyone who's my height would necessarily enjoy the same benefit from their height. So if you lived in a community where everyone else was also 6 inches taller than the national average, so if you were just in a community where most other people were tall, then even if I was 6 inches taller than the national average, I wouldn't benefit much from my height competing with other people for mates or jobs or anything like that. I would be normal relative to my context. The way in which you would benefit from being 6 inches taller than the national average would be to live in a community where a lot of other people were shorter than the national average or were just average, right? Which is all to say that privilege or unearned advantages in general are context dependent. To cash this out in the racial terms, so if you're a white person who lives in the communities with primarily other white people, then you actually don't get the same advantage from your race as you would if you're a white person who lives in a community with a lot of non-white people, especially if you live in a community, if you're relatively affluent and you live in a community with a lot of less affluent white people that you can exploit. And so as I illustrate at length in the book, this tendency to collapse these distinctions, to pretend as though a white person who works in finance in a city like New York City benefits from their race in the same way as someone who lives in a mostly white small town and so on and so forth, to pretend like they exploit non-white people in the same way or at the same rate or anything like that. Actually, it's false. So this is a case where you have a narrative that's about social justice and that seems oriented towards racial inequality, but what it does is actually distorts our understanding of who actually benefits from racialized inequalities and how specifically they benefit. And in fact, what this narrative about privilege sometimes does is actually help justify inequalities. So there's a lot of empirical research that shows when you educate people about privilege, it doesn't actually lead them to think any better or behave any differently towards non-white people. What it does is it leads them to dismiss and disparage and write off the suffering of poor white people. So basically, if you teach people that all white people have this privilege, then what a lot of people take from that is if you're white and you're poor, then you actually really truly deserve your poverty for not making good use of your privilege. That's actually the main impact of this teaching, according to the best available empirical research. So not only does it not help people behave or think differently towards non-whites, it actually leads them to justify inequalities and disparage the suffering of people who are poor and suffering on the basis of their skin color. And you see these kinds of tensions arise with a lot of well-intentioned, ostensibly social justice-oriented narratives and modes of activism.
One thread kind of running throughout is the claim that one of the things that the social justice narratives do or the privilege narratives do is underwrite some sort of sense of moral justification or moral superiority, and then perhaps counterintuitively a sort of victim mentality or sense of victimization. So how do you see that playing out, and how do you see that at work?
Yeah, so when you look at who's most likely to accept or espouse what you might think of as woke views or woke modes of political engagement, etc., it tends to be a pretty narrow and unusual slice of society. In particular, highly educated, relatively affluent people who live in cities or suburbs and are tied to the knowledge economy professions in some way. So people who work or aspire to work in jobs like media and finance or science and technology or education and so on and so forth. One of the things that's striking about a lot of these professions is that from the beginning of when these jobs were created, the high pay that we receive, the social prestige that people in these jobs receive, the autonomy we have compared to other employees, these were justified on the basis of the fact that these professions that we work in are fundamentally altruistic and that we serve the common good. And so you should give us more pay. You should give us more autonomy. You should give us more respect and prestige because we'll use that to help everyone in society, including and especially the least advantaged. And so journalists, for instance, are supposed to speak truth to power and be a voice for the voiceless. And academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads without favoring narratives based on political expediency or special interests and so on. Okay, so the fact that these jobs have been justified this way, that our salary and our prestige are justified this way, creates this really unusual mode of competition within these specific professions, within the specific slice of society, where people who do a really good job at presenting themselves as altruistic, as committed to helping people who need help, and so on, are viewed as being especially worthy, whereas people who are successfully painted as being beholden to special interests or inordinately concerned about themselves, holding the wrong kind of views, those people are viewed as being unworthy of power, of status, unworthy of even keeping their jobs, and they often lose their jobs when they're successfully painted that way. This shifted a little bit after things like the Civil Rights Act and Title IX. Before, when these jobs were created, they were initially restricted pretty much to only WASPs or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Organizations like the American Bar Association, for instance, would just not recognize schools that trained Black lawyers and would not admit Black lawyers to the bar. They were very explicitly, aggressively, unapologetically exclusionary. So after this started to change, and you started seeing more women, more minorities, more openly gay people, and so on being folded into these professions, this created a new mode of competition. So instead of just competing to prove that you are the best advocate or ally for disadvantaged groups, a growing number of people who are in these professions claim to be literal embodiments of different disadvantaged groups or claim to be both allies and victims of various forms of social injustice. This created a whole secondary arms race for status and power and influence within the symbolic professions. And so growing numbers of elites today, especially elites tied to these specific professions, arts and entertainment, law, finance, education, science, technology, and so on, try to find different ways of describing themselves as having belonged to some kind of historically marginalized and disadvantaged group. So non-white, female, neurodivergent, disabled, LGBTQ, the kind of sphere of different ways that you can be LGBTQ, of different ways that you can qualify as disabled or neurodivergent, and so on, also keep expanding, allowing a larger and larger strata of the elite to present themselves as kind of marginalized and disadvantaged instead of being elites. And this is actually a problem for a lot of social analysis, because the way that a lot of social scientists talk and think about problems like inequality, or talk and think about elites, is they talk about people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, not about people like Oprah Winfrey or Jay-Z, who are also billionaires. But if you're a non-white billionaire, or if you're a queer or female, neurodivergent or disabled elite in general, you're often excluded from analysis. So that the focus is on cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, neurotypical white men. And this is a problem because in a world where growing numbers of elites don't identify as that, if you only focus on those people, then you have this increasingly impoverished understanding of who the elites are, of who benefits from the social order, of how different social problems and different social phenomena reproduce over time. So it's really important to widen the lens and to look at people who identify as various marginalized and disadvantaged groups in the same way that you would talk and think about people who don't identify with those groups. And so that's one of the big projects of the book. I think one of the big things that this book does that's different.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Musa al-Gharbi. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and a full transcript. We also have a free bi-monthly newsletter in which I riff on themes and behind-the-scenes goings-on called the NSC Notebook. You can subscribe to that newsletter for free by going to our website at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. After the break, I can imagine somebody listening to what you just said and quickly coming to the conclusion that you are a black member of the hard right.
So I think people who read the book will see that while it is critical of a lot of what you might call social justice-oriented narratives and practices and behaviors, it's also very critical of anti-woke symbolic capitalists.
I'm Shankar Vedantam, here to tell you about a great mystery. That mystery is you. As the host of a podcast called Hidden Brain, I explore big questions about what it means to be human. Questions like, where do our emotions come from? Why do so many of us feel overwhelmed by modern life? How can we better understand the people around us? Discover your hidden brain. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
Given our contemporary, easy-to-hand partisan categorizations that are typically used in trying to understand who somebody is, I can imagine somebody listening to what you just said and quickly coming to the conclusion that you are a black member of the hard right. But it seems pretty clear that's not what you are, or not who you are. But for somebody hearing that and coming to that conclusion, what would you want to say at this point in the conversation?
So I think people who read the book will see that while it is critical of a lot of what you might call social justice-oriented narratives and practices and behaviors, it also is in the very interest of analyzing the world symmetrically. It's also very critical of anti-woke symbolic capitalists or right-aligned conservative symbolic capitalists. I argue and illustrate at various points in the book that most of the same narratives, most of the same facts, details, dynamics that I talk about when I'm talking about symbolic capitalists on the left hold just as true for non-left symbolic capitalists. The main difference is maybe there's marginally less hypocrisy insofar as it's not necessarily the case that a lot of the non-left symbolic capitalists paint themselves as allies of the marginalized and the disadvantaged. But even there, actually, they often do. So anti-woke symbolic capitalists, people who move aggressively in the opposite direction of most of their peers, they often do actually portray themselves as being committed to feminism and gay rights and anti-racism and related causes. They just think that those people, the wokes, are doing it wrong. But then an example that I talk about in the book is that a lot of anti-woke people, for instance, align themselves with Martin Luther King and his vision for, as they understand it, colorblind approach to racial justice, transcending our racial differences. But what's interesting about that is that a lot of the people who say, oh, we shouldn't be doing Black Lives Matter style anti-racism, we should be doing Martin Luther King style anti-racism, Okay, but are they doing Martin Luther King style anti-racism? Are they trying to organize or participate in marches like the Poor People's March and things like this? Are they trying to unite working people across racial lines to address social problems? No. They're doing the same thing that they're criticizing a lot of the woke people for, which is sitting in their armchairs railing about social problems. They think that criticizing the woke people, they equivocate that with doing something when it's not doing something any more than people changing their Instagram thing is doing something. There's a lot of symmetry that I underline in the book between a lot of these different symbolic capitalists. They often share the same mindsets, they have the same kinds of lifestyles, they live in the same kinds of communities. And so there's not, for our purposes, there's not a big difference. I focus a lot on the left-aligned symbolic capitalists because they're the overwhelming majority, to like 2-to-1 or more, depending on field, a majority of symbolic capitalists. But the story that I'm telling is about symbolic capitalists as a whole, and their political alignments really don't matter for the purposes of the story that I'm telling.
As I was reading through your book, I wondered, and I think you've already alluded that the answer might be yes, I wonder if there's a distinction to be made between the kind of elites you were describing and some of what in Nashville, for example, some would call social justice warriors who actually are on the streets with people and who actually are working on change in policy. Is that part of your sort of corrective that you're calling us to? Is this sort of, let's not just do this sort of what I guess some people would call virtue signaling, and I would note as well, there's a virtue signaling of the left and there's a virtue signaling of the right. But you're calling us beyond that to somehow really get in the mix of things that will have some sort of concrete effect and action in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that's important is I think a lot of times when people are committed to activism or committed to making change in social problems, what they'd like to do is find some way to address the social problem that doesn't require any kind of meaningful sacrifice or change on their part. The idea is, especially the idea that's most popular on the left among mainstream symbolic capitalists, is basically if we can just tax people like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk enough, we can solve all of these problems and we don't have to change anything. We can just continue. This is actually a fallacious argument for a few reasons. First, because one of the problems with taxing people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk is the fact that after we collect that money from them, who's going to redistribute it? Well, it's going to be us. And the idea that we're going to take this money and redistribute it evenly to the people who need it without taking anything for ourselves or our own communities or our own families or enriching ourselves in any way is nonsense. It's nonsense that the same kind of idea inspired a lot of people to attempt various forms of Marxist revolutions, and they consistently failed for this very reason, that the noble intelligentsia who was supposed to oversee this stuff were immediately corrupted by power and wealth because they're human beings. And you can see this actually, as I point in the book, when you look at the first, what I call the first Great Awakening back in the 1920s. So shortly after the income tax was passed and a lot of philanthropy as we understand it today started to be established, a lot of money was taken from the Gilded Age elites and redistributed. But when you look at who was it redistributed to, the primary wealth transfer that occurred during that period was actually from the wealthy to the upper middle class. We took from the rich and we gave to ourselves. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you might expect to happen again today. So this is one of the problems, is that there's actually not an easy way to take the money from the super rich and give it to the people who need it without running through people like us, with all that entails. And then the second problem with this narrative, as Richard Reeves and others have shown in his book, Dream Hoarders, and others have also, is that when you look at who's actually driving the lack of social mobility, the economic stagnation and stuff like this, it's actually mostly not the millionaires and the billionaires. In fact, if you look at the allocation of wealth in society, it's definitely true that the top 1% own a radically disproportionate share of wealth, but they don't own most of it. If you look at the top 20%, though, as someone like Reeves might suggest, the top 20% of Americans control 72% of all wealth in the country, leaving the other 80% of Americans to play with the other 28% of wealth. The idea that you can just tax the top 1% and leave the top 20% and somehow we can solve these problems is just not true. As Reeves said before, this narrative of we are the 99% is another way of mystifying social inequalities. It allows people who have healthy six-figure incomes, who are profiting from and perpetuating a lot of social problems to pretend as if they're just run-of-the-mill lunch bucket people who are in the same boat as working class Americans. And it's just not true. We're not in the same boat. We don't want to be in the same boat. We're actively bolstering our own boat by taking planks out of theirs. And so I think it's important. And one of the things that I try to emphasize in the book is that if we want to actually address a lot of these problems, there's actually not an easy way to do it that involves just taxing the super rich while we go about our own lives. It will actually require us to make important sacrifices, to make difficult choices. And the fundamental tension, I argue in the book, that has defined the symbolic professions basically from their creation, is that while a lot of us are committed to social justice, we also really want to be elites. We want to enjoy a higher position than most other people. We want other people to defer to us and to respect us more than other people. We don't think that people should take our opinion and someone working at McDonald's opinion in the same way. We think that our opinion should carry a lot more weight, not just about the areas in which we're experts, but in general. And these two drives are in tension, right? You can't be an egalitarian social climber. You can't be an egalitarian elite. These are two drives that we have that we're sincerely committed to on both ends, but they're in fundamental tension. And when push comes to shove, when we have to choose between perpetuating or enhancing our own position or helping our children reproduce our own position or climb up the ladder further versus living our social justice ends, when we're put in a position where we have to choose, and we do have to choose in many instances, it's the former drive that ends up dominating and that ends up subverting our pursuit of social justice, driving us to taking these more symbolic gestures instead of doing things that we could do in our own lives that could make a difference.
I want to turn to some of your biographical experience, but before we do that, I want to go back to the thing I said a moment ago that, again, is central, I think, to what your project is. In the introduction, you speak of analytical egalitarianism, and you say the problem is not that the, quote, wrong people are being preyed on, it's the preying per se. So unpack that for us a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes when you read social justice-oriented literature, the impression that you get is that the goal, their social vision for the world, would be to basically flip the existing hierarchies to, that's enough of white people oppressing people. Let's let Black people oppress the whites for a while, or let's let the women oppress the men for a while. Let's invert the status hierarchy. Rather than taking the ladder down, let's just change who's at the bottom and who's at the top. And so oftentimes in progressive spaces, people actually seem indifferent or even seem to experience, frankly, a perverse joy in the suffering of less affluent white people, in the suffering of men. So when you talk, for instance, there's a whole bunch of social data that people like Richard Reeves and others have compiled that by a lot of indexes, young men, especially less elite men, especially non-white men, are languishing in contemporary society. They're growing increasingly likely to die deaths of despair. They're being increasingly likely to move out and live independently, to get married, to be employed consistently. They're underemployed or unemployed altogether at increasingly high rates. When you look at who is it that's most likely to both commit violence but also die of violence, and who's most likely to be incarcerated and so on and so forth, it's men. But in a lot of feminist spaces, if you want to talk about the plight of men, if you want to talk about the fact that in a lot of fields, men are dramatically and increasingly underrepresented in those fields, the modal response you'll get is cry me a river. Ooh, boo-hoo for the poor men. And the same is true for whites. Like most poor people in America are white. It's true statistically that certain non-white populations are per capita more likely to be poor than a white person is per capita. But when you look at who are the poor people overall in America, a plurality of poor people in the United States are white. And so if you're only concerned about poverty when it affects certain groups, then you're going to miss the bulk of poverty. The idea that poverty is bad when it's Black poverty, but when white people are poor, they deserve it for not taking advantage of their privilege, or they deserve it because they hold noxious views, they hold the wrong views or vote for the wrong people. Holding that kind of a position is not actually an egalitarian position. It's a call to change the hierarchy, to basically have the same kind of exploitation, the same kind of oppression, but just to change who's the oppressor and who's the oppressee. And that's not exactly social justice.
You say in your online biography that I found fascinating, as I approached adulthood, I aspired to be a Catholic priest, prepared for that vocation through rigorous studies of Christian theology, scriptural exegesis, and higher criticism of the Bible. However, following the crisis of faith, I abandoned this calling. And then you say you went wandering and conceived of yourself as an atheist, but couldn't fit that on. So I would just be fascinated to hear you unpack some of that and share a little bit of that narrative with us.
So after I kind of abandoned my initial life plan, I really had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. So I was taking classes off and on in community college. And I shifted from doing private studies of theology to private studies of philosophy because it was a way to explore some of the same questions about the meaning of life and the nature of reality and so on and so forth, but just from a secular standpoint. So during this phase, I kind of rationally convinced myself that religion was nonsense and there was no God, but I couldn't feel it. I couldn't make myself feel it. Instead, I decided to try to investigate just other faith traditions to see if there was one that seemed to be a better fit. And so at the end of this journey, long story short, I ended up reading the Quran and I became convinced that it's a prophetic work. And Islam allowed me to actually accommodate a lot of the beliefs that I held related to Christianity, but while avoiding some of the theological issues that led me to abandon my initial calling. After spending 6 years taking classes off and on at community college, I got 4 degrees in the next 5 years, and I went from community college to an Ivy League university. So it was a combination really of getting a new clarity and sense of purpose from my religious journey and then having different stakes in life in virtue of being married and being a father. That really changed everything.
We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, Musa and I discuss how getting canceled by Fox News led him to surprising opportunities. Hey there. Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. It seems to me that given that you are Black Muslim, have a degree from top university in the country, given that you are could be misunderstood by people on the left as a right-winger and by people on the right as another run-of-the-mill progressive. It seems that all of that together, and perhaps more, puts you in a kind of socially precarious position. In many cases, a number of those kind of qualifiers or descriptions that I just listed could be used as a sort of marginalization identity that then could give you certain social cachet. Instead, you seem to be choosing to use all of those things to critique all of these things, right? And so it's like you could be taking advantage of this stuff, and yet instead you're probably socially precarious in the sense that you have people from all over the place that are going to be unhappy with you. So I don't know. How are you processing that, and how are you experiencing that, and what's driving you in this way?
Well, I think part of what drives me is that there are certain things that I can say that other people just can't say. An instance that I think about a lot was at Reed College. There was a professor who was teaching a class on classics. And there were protests that were constantly disrupting her class because the syllabus was insufficiently decolonialized and stuff like this. And so protesters would come in and disrupt the class every single day. She couldn't teach the class. The students just sat there and allowed this to happen. And then one day, a couple of students from India stood up and said, "Hey, come on, knock it off. Get out of here. Knock it off with this." And then all of a sudden, all of the other students also stood up and said, "Yeah, come on, get out of here. Don't come back here," and so on. They shut it down and they stopped it. The protest didn't come back. And so this is a case where everyone in the room basically disagreed, but no one felt comfortable disagreeing until there was someone, and it mattered that the first person who stood up was an Indian student. It's probably true if a white kid had stood up first and said, "Hey, knock it off, get out of here," that they would have criticized him. Like they would have immediately smeared him as a racist. A lot of the other white students, for fear of also being smeared as a racist, would have just sat there and allowed him to be smeared that way. And the protest would have continued or maybe even became more emboldened. So it did matter that the person who stood up was non-white. And so this is the kind of position that I find myself in some ways, where precisely because I can say things that other people can't say, in virtue of being a Black Muslim person who had previously lost a job, by the way, an academic job, for being targeted by Fox News, I'm in a position where I can say a lot of things without being smeared and villainized in the same way. And so I feel a pressure to say those things that are true that other people can't say.
One follow-up there, given all of that narrative trajectory you've described, and given the ironies that you just pointed to, for lack of a better word, what kind of temptations do you see yourself facing being now increasingly celebrated, to use the phrase you used earlier in the interview? I think you called it a fancy New York intellectual, right? Given all of the things that you're critiquing, you've learned to play the game, and now that you are speaking these things in the way that you're speaking them and it's getting the reception it's getting, what kind of temptations is that going to bring to you? Are there certain things that you're aware of that I know I'm going to have to be careful about X, Y, and Z, and these are the ways I'm going to try to deal with those?
Yeah, there are like three things that really kind of keep me up at night. One of them is that there's this hunger in a lot of mainstream symbolic capitalist spaces for someone to be like the secular preacher, the soul soother, I don't want to be the next Ibram X. Kendi, but the temptations to become the next Ibram X. Kendi are very pronounced. I mean, you can get, Kendi does talks, he gets 50,000 or more to do a talk. He has big centers, he gets in the New York Times and blah, 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 So there are all these incentives if you want to be the kind of person who kind of sells indulgences to. And so not doing that, trying to really keep this awkward distance that I currently have rolling. And a lot of people have wrestled with. Ta-Nehisi Coates has also talked about how he became the Black guy that white people cite all the time to show that they know stuff. This created a problem for him. And it's part of why he resigned from The Atlantic, is because he was in a position where everyone was really fawning over him, where he would be able to publish and say anything and everyone just eats it up and claps for him. And this actually made his work worse. It made his thinking worse. And he said things like this in interviews. It's like, how do you keep yourself sharp? How do you keep yourself grounded in a world where the very people that you're criticizing are eager to bear hug you and fold you in and incorporate the things you're saying into their own legitimation narratives? Yeah, so I don't want to be the next how to be an anti-racist guy. I do hope the book is successful. By all means, if I sell as many copies as Kendi, God bless the world. But the role I want to play is different. And then another risk that a lot of public intellectuals fall into sometimes is that when you go on these tours and you do these interviews, people ask you about stuff a lot of times that's not in your wheelhouse, but you feel a pressure to give them something. Or sometimes you even come to feel this arrogance that you know a lot more than you do. And so there are a number of people over the last decade or so who became prominent public intellectuals, where when you look at their work before, they were pretty careful thinkers who had considered things, and their work on their areas of specialization is actually good. But then a lot of the things that they talk about when they're coloring way outside of the lines are just sometimes frankly deranged. I want to not become that person also. And then the kind of last negative example that I want to avoid, there are a lot of thinkers who were in academia and they had heterodox views. And eventually they got tired of dealing with some of the tedious aspects of holding non-conventional views in academia, dealing with levels of gatekeeping and scrutiny that other scholars do not have to deal with, or constant kind of political nonsense. And so that leads some people to exit. In my experience, looking at some of these people who have made that move, it's actually made their thinking worse and their work worse. So this is what I want to avoid, is the more prolific you get, the easier it can be to sometimes escape the orbit of normal gatekeeping and criticism. And there's a lot of temptations to do that too. It's just easier. Everything is easier. You just say what you want. You don't have to worry about all the nonsense. Trying to avoid that temptation is another thing that I think about a lot.
Yeah, thank you for that. Two last questions as we close. You alluded, for example, to being publicly sharply criticized by Fox News. And then on the other hand, being academically canceled, if you will, by progressive left-leaning circles. And yet, you strike me as someone who has this sort of deeply, genuinely ironic spirit, in a peaceable way about you. And so I just wonder what has fueled or made possible assuming what I'm seeing is at least somewhat true, what fuels this sort of peaceable way to try to keep telling the truth as you understand it, but do it in a way where you're not demeaning or demonizing or further fueling the partisan hostilities that we have all around us?
Well, so what happened with the Fox News thing in the first place is the way that I engage today isn't the way that I used to engage necessarily. So before, I wrote for outlets like Al Jazeera and other Middle East-oriented outlets, and I was speaking mostly to people who already agreed with me. And as I became increasingly prolific, for instance, at Al Jazeera America, I regularly published articles that would get like tens of thousands of shares. I wrote the #1 most read article ever on the history of that site until it closed, and so on. And so as I became increasingly prolific, I think I got a little too big for my britches, kind of epistemically or cognitively or whatever. So someone from that industry came across this journal article that I wrote and decided to try to troll me on it on Twitter. And so I basically tried to destroy this guy. I showed that he was completely ignorant about the empirical facts. And then as he started to clearly lose the empirical side, he tried to shift to these discussions about liberty and justice and stuff. And I was like, great, I'm a philosopher. Let's do that. Really just twisted the knife, showing that this is a vacuous individual. The problem with that is that I was at the time an adjunct professor and a columnist for Al Jazeera, but he had access to Fox News. And so as a result of humiliating this person and getting under his skin this way, he launched a smear campaign to try to get me fired from University of Arizona, taking bits and pieces of things that I wrote in different outlets, taking them way out of context, often to argue the opposite of what I argued, and trying to portray me as some kind of anti-American radical, which is perverse, of course, because again, the only reason I do the work that I was doing at all was because I personally know loss from war, and that I come from a military family and a military community. But in the aftermath of losing my job and then getting denied access to PhD programs at that same school, I did a lot of soul searching. For one, I felt a lot of guilt. Every department and institution that I was affiliated with at University of Arizona got flooded with death threats and hate mail. And I felt non-trivial guilt for having brought upon my colleagues this kind of chaos as a result of my own social media hot talking. And I sat with a lot this question of why is it that so many people were willing to believe this kind of insane caricature of me that was being painted on Fox News? And there's a not good way that you could answer that question, which is to say, well, the reason they were willing to believe that is because those people are a bunch of brain dead people being indoctrinated by the Koch brothers and blah, 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 blah. But that was unsatisfying to me intellectually and otherwise, in part because, again, I grew up in the military. I know most of my friends and family and loved ones and stuff, like people who were conservatives or Republicans or GOP people, even though that wasn't necessarily my own persuasion. So I know those people weren't like some mysterious entity to me. They were my people in a deep sense, even though I disagreed with them on a lot of moral and political views. So I couldn't go that route, not in an intellectually honest way. And as I was sitting there thinking about this, I realized that a big part of the problem is that people like me didn't necessarily engage with people like them much at all. And when we did, it was usually in this kind of hostile, condescending, combative kind of way. And so I responded to getting canceled by Fox News by trying to write more for the right. So I started taking the same outlets, the same articles that I would normally send to Al Jazeera or Salon or somewhere like that. I didn't change anything about the argument, which is to say I didn't refrain from saying anything that I would say in Al Jazeera or somewhere. I didn't say anything that I didn't believe. I just changed the way that I conveyed the ideas to reach different kinds of audiences. And so I started taking those same essays and pitching them to places like the National Interest and National Review and the American Conservative. And not only were these other places willing to publish, I just assumed, like as a Black Muslim intellectual, who would want to hear what I have to say? Oh, probably left-leaning outlets. I never even tried to pitch to right-leaning outlets. But the response that I got was really great. A lot of people on the right were eager to explore these issues and mix it up with someone who was different from them, who didn't share the same priors. And the act of going through and making these arguments in a way that where I wasn't preaching to the choir, but where I was having to convey these ideas in a different way, and then engaging with those audiences afterwards in the comments and questions and back and forth. All of that really enriched my understanding of the social world. It led me to be able to perceive blind spots and assumptions that I had that were just wrong about a lot of the things that I was arguing and thinking about. It led me to reevaluate the work that I had previously been doing. So for instance, if you want to convince people not to bomb Syria, if you think that bombing Syria is a bad idea and there are people who want to bomb Syria, it doesn't do a lot of good to go to an outlet full of people who already agree that bombing Syria is a bad idea and say, yeah, you're right, I agree. What you need to do, if you actually want to prevent that outcome, is you need to go to the people who think it's actually a great idea to bomb Syria, it's actually important and necessary. You need to go to those people and explain to them why it's actually not a good idea. And you need to explain it to them in a way that they'll find accessible and compelling and persuasive. It doesn't actually do a lot of good to just give red meat to people who already agree with you. And so as a result of coming to that realization, it changed the way that I do a lot of my work. So today, no matter who I write for, I try to say something that I think that audience needs to hear but doesn't want to hear. I'll add, as a kind of sign of how far I've traveled down this path, I was recently invited to Fox News to talk about my research about exploring how social scientists and journalists often misperceive Trump voters. I was on the Ingram angle. I was into Fox News studio, yucking it up, sitting there with Sean Hannity, talking to people. And it was surreal. One of the things that was surreal was I realized that for me, this targeted cancellation campaign that they did was deeply personal. But for them, for the one guy who started the whole thing, it was definitely personal. I humiliated him. He wanted to destroy me. He succeeded, at least in the short term. But for everyone else involved with that, they just needed to fill airtime until it was on election day 2014 that they did this. While they were waiting for the Senate to see who took control of the Senate, they just had to kill some airtime. And so they just casually destroyed my life as a way of just filling the air. There was nothing personal about it. And in a way, that's even more horrifying because if someone does something to you that's devastating, you almost hope that they have some investment in it, that they're passionate about it. But it was just, it's just content. And so, I was there in the Fox News. I did a great interview with Laura Ingraham. No one remembered or cared about the fact that they had.
Fascinating.
So this is a sign of how much has shifted, both in terms of how I engage with other people and how other people engage with me, by virtue of adopting this alternative approach to engaging in the world with people.
Thank you for all of that. If you were to, someone listens to you, someone reads your book, their question is, give me some practical wisdom for engagement in the world out of what you've seen and what you've learned. What might be 2, 3 aphorisms, bits of wisdom that you would share in that regard?
The first one is to really focus on the people you're trying to help. What do they actually need? What do they actually want? A lot of times activists, when they're engaging in activism, they do things that are satisfying to them or useful to them, but might not well reflect the interests and desires and needs of the people that you're trying to help. So I would invite people to take a little time, do a little bit of research, and prioritize that instead of what's useful for us. The other thing that I would urge people to do, if you're talking about your racial identity, if you're talking about race or racial issues as an African American or a Hispanic person or a non-white person, how often are you talking about your own experiences and your own backgrounds and your own interests and your own desires versus the interests of people who actually need help? So I guess the second thing to emphasize is try to find ways to decenter yourself. There's this temptation, in part because you learn these scripts when you're in these institutions, that what you're supposed to do is actually make it about yourself. You're supposed to talk about poverty and disadvantage and prejudice and discrimination and fold yourself into the picture and tell this heroic bootstrapping account or whatever. But this kind of thing that we do to jump through gatekeeping hoops ends up distorting our understanding of the world because we end up doing it even when we're not trying to write an essay to get into Harvard or something. We end up doing it just when we're having conversations about social issues in general. We seamlessly move the conversation from talking about impoverished people who are actually being targeted by police to talking about the microaggressions that we suffered at work, as if those things are even remotely in the same universe of problems. They're not. I would urge people to be mindful of the fact of how often they're talking about themselves when they don't need to be and probably shouldn't be when they're discussing social issues.
We've been talking to Dr. Musa al-Gharbi at the School of Communication Journalism at Stony Brook University on his new book, We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. Musa, thank you so much for the conversation today and your work and your lovely spirit that you bring to it. We're so very grateful.
Thank you for the kind words, and thank you for having me.
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with Musa al-Gharbi. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
Hey there, Jacob Lewis here, executive producer of the show, as well as co-host of all of the bonus material that you will hear with Lee on No Small Endeavor Plus. And I just wanted to chime in and share a little taste of our conversation we had recently with songwriter Andy Gullahorn. So the context here is that on NSE Plus, all those bonus episodes, rather than talk about the good life, we conduct experiments with a guest derived from our many interviews that Lee has had with amazing people over the years. And this month, we tackled climate change, and we've assigned singer-songwriter Andy Gullahorn the task of making a climate action Venn diagram. This is derived from our interview with Dr. Ayanna Johnson. And then he's got to take some sort of action toward what he comes up with on that climate Venn diagram. Here's a little taste of that conversation.
Did you ever interview Peter Harris?
Yeah.
Like, getting to know Peter over the years, I was thinking about that when you're talking about, he talks about doing climate work is like sitting with a dying friend and asking, you're saying having both feet firmly and like, yeah, there's some serious stuff that is happening here, but is there still something beautiful? Like, if there wasn't a way to completely change all the damage that has been done, is it still worth loving? So getting to be around people like that who ask those kinds of questions, and I just get to learn from them.
Yeah.
All right, that was just a snippet of our NSE Plus conversation. If you want to hear the whole episode, right now, go to nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSE Plus.